On the morning of October 6th, 1989, the quiet town of Noel, Missouri woke up to a mystery unlike anything it had ever seen. With a population of just over 2,000 people, Noel was the kind of town where everyone knew their neighbors. Serious crime was almost unheard of, but that peaceful reputation was about to be shattered. Just after 8 a.m., a bank teller arrived for work at the Bank of Noel, expecting an ordinary Friday morning. Instead, she found the front door already unlocked. At first, nothing seemed unusual. She assumed the bank manager, Dan Short, had arrived early and opened the building before her. But as she walked deeper inside, something immediately felt wrong. The massive steel vault stood wide open. Cash drawers had been emptied. Coins were scattered across the floor. The vault was in complete disarray. She called the police immediately. Within minutes, local deputies secured the scene. Because the bank was federally insured, the case quickly fell under the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What initially appeared to be a routine bank robbery soon revealed something investigators had never encountered before. The numbers simply didn't make sense. The thieves had ignored nearly $970,000 in paper currency, money that weighed only around 66 pounds and could have been carried away with ease. Instead, they stole only $70,000 worth of coins. Those coins weighed more than 1,300 pounds, over 600 kilograms. It was an almost unbelievable decision. Why would experienced criminals leave behind nearly $1 million in lightweight cash, only to struggle away with half a ton of loose change? Nothing about the robbery followed logic, and as investigators dug deeper, things became even stranger. The surveillance camera had been deliberately disabled. Someone had sprayed its lens with black paint before firing multiple shots into it with a .45 caliber handgun, destroying the camera completely. Whoever carried out the robbery knew exactly where the camera was located. They knew exactly how to avoid being recorded, and they left almost nothing behind. It wasn't just a robbery, it was a meticulously planned operation. Investigators photographed every inch of the bank, searching for fingerprints, fibers, tool marks, and anything that could identify the people responsible. But one question quickly overshadowed every other. Where was Dan Short? The bank manager hadn't shown up for work that morning. No one had seen him. No one could reach him. At first, investigators considered the obvious possibility. Had Dan Short orchestrated the robbery himself? Or had something far more sinister happened during the night? The answer would transform a baffling bank robbery into one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Missouri history. Investigators wasted no time. If Dan Short had simply failed to report for work, there could have been dozens of innocent explanations. But after what they had already seen inside the bank, nobody was willing to dismiss the possibility that something far more serious had happened. A team of officers drove to Dan's home to perform a welfare check. The house was quiet. His vehicle was parked outside, exactly where it should have been. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, and nothing that immediately suggested violence. Still, something felt wrong. The officers knocked several times. No answer. After receiving permission to enter, they began searching the residence room by room. Inside, everything appeared strangely normal. Furniture was in place. Personal belongings had been left untouched. There was no indication that Dan had packed for a trip or left voluntarily. It looked as though he had simply disappeared. Then, investigators noticed something that instantly changed the direction of the case. There were traces of blood. Not large pools, not enough to suggest someone had died inside the house, but enough to prove that someone had been injured. Crime scene technicians immediately began documenting every inch of the residence. Samples were collected, photographed, and sent for forensic analysis. The discovery eliminated the comforting possibility that Dan had simply gone missing. Now investigators had to consider a much darker reality. Somewhere between leaving his home and the discovery of the robbed bank, something had happened to the bank manager. The question was whether he had been kidnapped or murdered. As officers expanded their search around the property, another clue emerged. Investigators found evidence indicating that Dan had left the house during the night, but not under ordinary circumstances. The timeline was beginning to take shape. Whoever planned the robbery almost certainly knew Dan personally, or at the very least understood his routine. They knew he possessed the vault combinations. They knew he could disable security systems, and they knew that forcing him to cooperate would be far easier than trying to break into a federally insured bank. This no longer looked like a robbery committed by desperate criminals. It looked like a carefully orchestrated operation that had begun hours before anyone realized a crime had even taken place. Meanwhile, forensic teams returned to the bank to reconstruct every minute leading up to the robbery. They confirmed that the vault had not been blown open or forced with heavy equipment. There were no pry marks, no explosives, no evidence of a violent break-in. Someone had opened the vault using the proper procedures. That meant one of two things. Either Dan Short had opened it himself, or someone had forced him to do it. The investigation had now crossed an invisible line. This was no longer just a bank robbery. It was officially being treated as a kidnapping investigation, with growing fears that it could soon become a homicide. As FBI agents interviewed Dan's family, friends, co-workers, and neighbors, a picture of his life began to emerge. By every account, Dan Short was dependable, respected, and deeply committed to both his family and his job. No one described him as reckless. No one believed he would abandon his life. And no one thought he would ever willingly steal from the bank he had managed for years. If Dan wasn't the mastermind, then he was almost certainly a victim. What investigators didn't yet know was that hundreds of miles away, pieces of the puzzle were already beginning to surface. And when those pieces were finally connected, they would reveal one of the most cold-blooded bank robbery conspiracies Missouri had ever seen. The breakthrough came sooner than investigators expected. Not because of a confession, not because someone came forward with new information, but because a body had been found. On the afternoon of October 6th, search teams discovered Dan Short's body in a remote, rural area outside Noel. He had been executed with a single gunshot to the head. The discovery confirmed everyone's worst fears. From that moment forward, the investigation was no longer centered on a bank robbery. It had become a murder case. The medical examiner determined that Dan had likely been killed only hours before the robbery was discovered. The timing suggested he had been kept alive long enough to open the bank, cooperate with his captors, and then was eliminated once he was no longer useful. It was a chilling conclusion. The killers had never intended to leave witnesses behind. As news spread across McDonald County, shock turned to fear. Noel wasn't a city accustomed to violent crime. Murders were exceptionally rare, and the idea that someone could kidnap a respected bank manager, force him to open the vault, and then execute him in cold blood seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The FBI expanded the investigation immediately. Agents established roadblocks, interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, and began tracing every vehicle reported near the bank during the previous 24 hours. Every employee was questioned. Every customer was identified. Every known associate of Dan Short was examined. Investigators also focused on one crucial question: how much planning had gone into this crime? The answer became increasingly clear. This wasn't something conceived overnight. The robbers knew the bank's schedule. They knew when employees arrived. They knew security procedures. They knew the surveillance camera's exact location. Most importantly, they knew that Dan Short possessed the authority and knowledge required to access the vault without triggering suspicion. That level of information wasn't easy to obtain. Someone had done their homework. Someone had studied the bank carefully, or someone had help from the inside. As forensic specialists reconstructed the crime scene, another detail stood out. Despite stealing nearly $70,000 in coins, the robbers had shown remarkable discipline. They hadn't wandered through the bank searching for valuables. They had gone directly to specific areas, completed their objective, and disappeared. Everything pointed toward a carefully rehearsed plan. But one decision continued to haunt investigators. Why the coins? Nearly $1 million in paper currency had been sitting inside the vault. Portable, easy to conceal, easy to spend. Instead, the thieves chose an enormous load of heavy coin bags that required significant effort to transport. At first glance, it made no sense. But experienced investigators knew criminals rarely make decisions without a reason. If they ignored the cash, perhaps they had never intended to take it. Or perhaps they couldn't. The possibility raised another disturbing question. Had something interrupted the robbery? Or were they following instructions from someone who understood exactly which assets could be traced. Agents began examining where the stolen coins might eventually surface. Unlike paper currency, many bags of coins carried identifying wrappers, shipment records, or markings linking them to financial institutions. Moving that amount of coinage without attracting attention would be extremely difficult. Eventually, someone would have to exchange it. Eventually, someone would make a mistake. The FBI was prepared to wait. Meanwhile, investigators dug deeper into Dan Short's personal life. They reviewed financial records, telephone logs, business relationships, family history, anything that might reveal a motive beyond simple robbery. What they found surprised them. There was no evidence that Dan was living a double life. No hidden debts, no gambling addiction, no criminal associations, no signs that he had voluntarily participated in the crime. Everything continued to point in the same direction. Dan Short had been selected because of his position, not because of who he was. Somewhere, the people responsible believed they had executed the perfect crime. They had disabled the cameras, left almost no forensic evidence, eliminated the only person who could identify them, and vanished before sunrise. For a brief moment, it looked as though they might actually get away with it. They couldn't have known that the smallest oversight, something so ordinary that none of them considered it important, would eventually unravel the entire conspiracy. For weeks, the investigation appeared to be at a standstill. Hundreds of interviews had been conducted. Thousands of leads had been reviewed. Every promising tip seemed to end in another dead end. The people responsible had disappeared without leaving a clear trail. Yet the FBI refused to believe the robbery had been flawless. Crimes this carefully planned almost always required multiple people. And the more people involved, the greater the chance that someone would eventually make a mistake. Agents began looking beyond Noel. They contacted banks across Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, asking them to report any unusually large deposits of coins matching the amount stolen from the Bank of Noel. At the same time, investigators quietly monitored businesses where large quantities of coins might naturally appear: casinos, vending companies, laundromats, amusement centers, and wholesale distributors. The logic was simple. No matter how well the robbery had been executed, $70,000 in coins couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone would have to spend them. And when they did, the investigation would begin moving again. Months passed. The headlines slowly disappeared. Outside Noel, most people assumed the killers had escaped for good. Even inside the town, life gradually returned to normal. But behind the scenes, FBI agents were still working the case every single day. Every new lead was compared against thousands of pages of reports. Every anonymous phone call was investigated. Every rumor was documented. Then, almost a year after the robbery, something unexpected happened. An informant contacted investigators with information that immediately caught their attention. The tip wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confession. It was simply the name of a man who had been talking far too confidently about the robbery. At first, agents treated the information cautiously. False tips were common in high-profile investigations. But as they began digging into the man's background, disturbing connections started to emerge. He knew people with criminal histories. He had access to vehicles capable of transporting heavy cargo. Most importantly, his movements around the time of the robbery didn't fully match the story he had originally given investigators. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to justify surveillance. For weeks, agents quietly watched. They tracked vehicles, reviewed financial activity, recorded meetings, compared statements made by different individuals. Slowly, the outline of a criminal network began taking shape. The FBI no longer believed they were looking for one killer. They were looking for a conspiracy. As investigators identified additional suspects, another pattern became impossible to ignore. Many of them already knew each other. Some had worked together before. Others were connected through friends and relatives. Each new discovery strengthened the same conclusion. This wasn't a random robbery. It had been organized by a group that trusted one another long before Dan Short was ever targeted. The investigation intensified. Search warrants were executed. Homes were searched. Firearms were seized. Financial records were examined in extraordinary detail. Still, the evidence remained largely circumstantial. Agents needed something stronger, something that would place the suspects together during the planning or execution of the crime. Then, one of the suspects made a decision that changed everything. Believing the case had gone cold, he became careless. He began speaking about the robbery to people he thought he could trust. What he didn't realize was that word eventually reached someone with far more to gain from cooperating with federal authorities than protecting old friends. That individual agreed to talk. At first, only small details were shared. Names, meeting places, vehicles. Nothing that could immediately prove murder. But every statement was independently verified. And every verified statement gave investigators greater confidence that they were finally closing in on the people responsible. As interviews continued, the witness revealed something investigators had been searching for since the very beginning. The robbery hadn't started at the bank. It had started days earlier. The group had carefully planned every stage of the operation. They studied Dan Short's schedule. They discussed the security system. They chose locations where they believed they could avoid being seen. Nothing had been left to chance, except one thing: human nature. Because once one member of the conspiracy decided to protect himself, the silence that had kept the case buried for nearly a year began to collapse. One conversation led to another. One witness became two, then three. Before long, investigators weren't trying to discover who had committed the crime anymore. They were trying to determine who had pulled the trigger and who would testify to save themselves. Federal prosecutors now faced a new challenge. Solving the case was no longer enough. They had to prove it in court. That meant separating rumors from evidence, identifying who had participated in the planning, who had carried out the robbery, and ultimately, who had murdered Dan Short. Every statement was scrutinized. Every witness was cross-examined before formal charges were even filed. Investigators knew the defense would attack every inconsistency, every memory, and every assumption. If they rushed the case, years of work could collapse inside a courtroom, so they built it piece by piece. The witness who had begun cooperating described meetings that took place before the robbery. According to investigators, the group had discussed how to gain control of the bank manager without attracting attention, how to enter the bank after hours, and how to leave the area before employees arrived the following morning. More importantly, the witness described the role each participant allegedly played during the operation. Those statements were compared with physical evidence, vehicle records, telephone calls, receipts, witness sightings, every independent detail that could either support or destroy the testimony. Again and again, the facts lined up. The conspiracy that had once existed only in theory was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. As investigators confronted additional suspects with the growing body of evidence, the pressure began to mount. Some continued to deny everything. Others changed their stories repeatedly. A few admitted being involved in the robbery, but insisted they had never intended for anyone to die. That distinction would become one of the central battles of the case, because under federal law, participating in an armed robbery that results in murder can carry consequences just as severe as pulling the trigger yourself. The investigation now focused on reconstructing the final hours of Dan Short's life. Witness testimony suggested he had been confronted at his home during the night, forced into cooperating, taken to the bank under armed guard, made to open the vault, then driven away once the robbery was complete. For Dan, there had never been a realistic chance of survival. From the moment the plan began, the conspirators allegedly intended to eliminate the only witness capable of identifying them. That realization transformed the crime in the eyes of prosecutors. This wasn't a robbery that spiraled out of control. It was a calculated execution built into the plan from the very beginning. As arrests were finally made, the quiet town of Noel watched in disbelief. People recognized the names appearing in newspapers and television reports. Some of the accused weren't strangers passing through town. They were individuals with connections to the region, people who had blended into everyday life while investigators spent months trying to identify them. The illusion of a perfect crime had finally come apart, but the legal battle was only beginning. Defense attorneys argued that many of the government's witnesses had cooperated only to reduce their own sentences. They questioned memories, motives, timelines. They claimed the prosecution had built its case around people desperate to save themselves. Federal prosecutors expected those attacks. That's why they had spent months corroborating every critical detail with independent evidence. No single witness would decide the outcome. The strength of the case came from how the evidence overlapped. Each statement confirmed another. Each document supported another timeline. Each forensic finding eliminated another alternative explanation. By the time jurors heard the full sequence of events, prosecutors argued that the conspiracy could be understood from beginning to end without relying on any single person's word. It was a mosaic. Remove one piece, and the picture remained intact. For Dan Short's family, however, no verdict could undo what had happened. A respected husband, father, and community member had been forced to participate in the robbery of the bank he faithfully managed, only to be murdered moments later. The money stolen that night could eventually be recovered. The people responsible could be arrested, but nothing would restore the life that had been taken. As the trial drew to a close, the jury faced a question that had haunted the investigation from the very first day. Had the government proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that this wasn't simply one man's crime, but a carefully planned conspiracy ending in cold-blooded murder? After weeks of testimony, forensic analysis, and exhaustive cross-examinations, the case was finally placed in the jury's hands. The deliberations represented the final chapter of an investigation that had begun with an unlocked bank door on a quiet October morning. Now, 12 jurors had to decide whether the evidence proved the government's case beyond a reasonable doubt. For Dan Short's family, every hour of waiting felt endless. They had spent years reliving the worst day of their lives, listening to recordings, studying photographs, and hearing witnesses describe the final hours of a man who had simply gone to work. Nothing about the trial could change the outcome. Justice, if it came, would never erase the loss. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was silent. One by one, the verdicts were read aloud. The defendants were found guilty on the major federal charges stemming from the robbery, the kidnapping, and the murder of Dan Short. For prosecutors, it marked the successful conclusion of one of the most complex criminal investigations the region had ever seen. For the defense, every avenue of reasonable doubt had ultimately failed to overcome the evidence. In the months that followed, the court imposed lengthy federal prison sentences on those convicted for their roles in the conspiracy. Some would spend decades behind bars. Others received life sentences, ensuring they would never again walk free. The punishment reflected not only the robbery itself, but the calculated decision to murder an innocent man in order to eliminate the only witness capable of identifying those responsible. Looking back, investigators would later acknowledge just how close the conspirators had come to succeeding. On paper, the robbery had been meticulously planned. The surveillance camera had been destroyed. The bank manager had been silenced. The criminals had left almost no physical evidence inside the bank. For a time, it genuinely appeared as though they had committed the perfect crime. But perfect crimes rarely exist. No matter how carefully a conspiracy is planned, it still depends on people. People make mistakes. People become careless. People talk. And when enough time passes, loyalties begin to fade. Fear gives way to self-preservation. That was ultimately what destroyed the conspiracy behind the Bank of Noel robbery. Not a dramatic chase, not a lucky fingerprint, not a hidden security camera. It was the gradual collapse of trust between the very people who believed they had planned the perfect crime. One witness led to another. One inconsistency exposed another. One decision to cooperate unraveled years of carefully guarded silence. By the end of the investigation, federal agents had reconstructed nearly every step of the conspiracy, from the planning meetings to the abduction of Dan Short to the robbery itself, and finally to the murder intended to erase the only eyewitness forever. For the people of Noel, October 6th, 1989 remains a date that changed their town forever. A community known for its quiet streets and close-knit neighbors suddenly found itself at the center of a nationally significant federal murder investigation. Even decades later, the case continues to serve as a reminder that extraordinary crimes can happen in the most ordinary places. It also stands as a testament to the patience of investigators who refused to accept that a carefully executed robbery was unsolvable. They followed every lead, questioned every assumption, and continued working long after public attention had faded. In the end, that persistence accomplished what the killers believed was impossible. It gave Dan Short a voice. It gave his family answers. And it ensured that those responsible would spend the rest of their lives defined not by the money they stole, but by the life they took. What do you think about this case? Let me know in the comments. I read them all. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next investigation.